Let's get ready to rumble!
Part of the point about trying something that no one has succeeded before and knowing that you will probably fail is that you are also out there to challenge yourself. How far can you go? How much can you achieve? In most of our lives, we never come close to actually pushing to our outermost limit. So part of the challenge is to find out exactly how far can you go? How much are you prepared to sacrifice? And at what point do you say, this is my limit?
Speak to you.
Sure. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing.
So basically, I've been doing quite a few interviews with a couple of people, basically who do athletes, a couple of Olympians, up and coming, etc. But they do. I'm looking to find people who do stuff that isn't very ordinary, if you know what I mean. It's the idea of it being trying to uncover some stuff that people aren't aware of, essentially. And so for a project, I'm putting together a portfolio of these interviews with people, basically just to show that, well, to get the interviews themselves, but also to show that I can conduct them, if you know what I mean. So for someone like yourself that has done stuff that is way out of the ordinary, it's a perfect example, I think.
So the outcome of this for you is essentially what? It's a university project, and you need a portfolio of you doing interviews?
Yes, essentially, just to show that I can do them, because there's not really been a better opportunity than the situation we're in now, where people are, ironically enough, much more free to do these sort of things.
Yes, essentially stuck at home and fairly bored. And
exactly.
Happy to talk to random strangers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. Okay.
But no, as long as you're happy with that, and before we start, if there's anything you don't want to talk about, I'm more than happy to just skip over it. But I don't think there's anything there that's too off the rails. But just as a little bit of an introduction, and just to introduce yourself and why it is that you are well known.
Right, I'm Cathy O'Dowd. I'm a mountaineer and a motivational speaker. I'm best known for having been the first woman in the world to climb Everest from both the south and north sides. I was also the first South African to climb Everest.
And it's interesting actually, because my next question was going to be, how is it you refer to yourself? Is it, 'cause you said you call yourself a mountaineer there, but you don't prefer the term like adventurer or explorer, you prefer mountaineer?
All of these terms are increasingly loaded
Right.
in the 21st century. And frankly, as we get fewer and fewer places left that are genuinely exploratory, and fewer sort of expedition projects that are genuinely adventurous, we're getting a massive rise in #adventure, which is not the same thing at all. The one that drives me up the wall that I came across recently was #extreme sleeping, which turns out to be sleeping anywhere that isn't actually a pay-for-it campsite, which when I was young was just called going camping.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think there's much of a difference.
So no, I don't call myself mostly an adventurer. I certainly don't call myself an explorer. No, I climb things. Sometimes they're big mountains, sometimes they're rock faces. And I do a certain amount of other stuff in the mountains. I do some stuff that you could probably call ski mountaineering, certainly ski touring, and a certain amount of just running around having fun. But mountains and climbing, I think, are where it lands for me.
So what was it that got you into this then? Because obviously, it's, as I mentioned before, it's not by any means usual, the things that you do. You know, you go out your way to do stuff that people have never done before. So what gives you that urge to achieve things like that?
Well, that's actually not entirely true, in that things that haven't been done before are the ones that kind of make a splash in the world. But that's only a small percentage of what I actually choose to go out and do.
Right.
So those are the things that are, for want of a better word, marketable. So I make my living giving speeches about some of the things I've done in the mountains. Yeah. Or kind of, honestly, that's not 100% true. I make my living turning some of the things I've done into case studies for corporate clients, which is a little different. But, you know, essentially, if you want to market something, world first, records, all of that, it's useful. But that's actually only a small percentage of what I've done in the mountains. And it's not, you know, it's not the thing that gets me out of bed in the morning, if you like. So I started rock climbing when I got to university, because I could, because I liked outdoor sports, because I'd grown up in the suburbs of a big city. I hadn't had many opportunities, but I had tried rock climbing once as a teenager on a summer camp and liked it. So I joined the climbing club and loved rock climbing, having been useless at all the kind of conventional team sports at school. And I went to one of those, an all-girls school that was kind of, I'm South African, but it was modeled on a British public school in the slightly old-fashioned sense. Right. So we did ladies' sports. Oh my God, it was dreadful. I didn't enjoy any of them, and I wasn't any good at any of them. So finding an outdoor activity that wasn't competitive, that wasn't a team sport, that was kind of wild and free and personal and it didn't come with rules and limits and winners and losers. I loved all of that. And after that, I've always, frankly, been driven by curiosity. You know, once I was rock climbing, I was curious about trying a bigger rock face, and I was curious about trying something that would get called a mountain rather than a cliff. And then I was curious about something where there was snow involved, because South Africa obviously is not much of a winter sport country. So my first expedition took me to Central Africa, 5,000 meters, some ancient glaciers in the mountains of the moon, the Ruwenzori. And then after that, off to the Andes to try and get a little bit higher. And so by the time I ended up with my first Everest expedition, it wasn't because I wanted to climb Everest. I didn't. I wanted to go to the Himalaya. I'd have taken any mountain in the Himalaya. But it's not as if they were commercial expeditions. when I was a young climber. It was so difficult to find any expeditions going to the Himalaya from South Africa, let alone to get invited to join one of them.
Yeah.
So my first Himalayan opportunity was about effectively being, if we're honest, the token woman joining the first South African Everest expedition.
Right.
So that's why it was Everest.
But it's interesting then, because you mentioned it's that the sort of achieving side is very, very small percentage. So how long had you been climbing before you got to the Everest point?
Okay, let's think. So I started, it's kind of climbing is a continuum with kind of different activities along the continuum.
Yeah, yeah.
So I started rock climbing at 18. I started mountaineering at 21. And I was 27 when I went to Everest. But I think there's something people often miss, is that you don't go on an expedition with the absolute assumption that you will get to the top, or even that you're good enough to get to the top. Again, possibly modern commercial expeditions have changed that, because you've hired a guide to get you to the summit. It's a different game. But I learned mountaineering when the only way to learn was by apprenticeship.
Right.
You got onto teams with people who were better than you. You learned as an apprentice, kind of being mentored by other people. And you went as far as you could safely go. And then you stopped and waited while the best people in the team finished the mountain, or, however it worked. And that was a perfectly normal way of doing things. So it was perfectly realistic for me to be on an Everest team with no assumption that I was good enough to get to the summit of Everest. I had no idea. I didn't know what I'd climbed in the Andes compared with what was going to be required on Everest. And then, of course, I'd never been to that altitude. So that was a complete unknown. So, I in no sense, went to Everest thinking, look at me, Everest conqueror. I went to Everest thinking, cool, Himalayan expedition. I'll get to learn a whole bunch of stuff, and I'll go as far as I go.
So how did that come about then? Because like you said, it was almost like you were the token woman to be doing it.
No, I really was the token woman. So, trust me, it was pretty bizarre. So the guy who dreamt up the whole project raised all the sponsorship for it. So this is just a personal endeavor. One man has a dream, raises the sponsorship because it's expensive. He then invites a team, the best mountaineers in South Africa, which is not saying a great deal. South Africa, we've just emerged from apartheid sanctions. We hadn't been able to travel freely. The best in South Africa are big fish in a puddle. But nevertheless, there he goes. He's got his team, the best men. And there was a newspaper who was one of the big sponsors. And the newspaper, South Africa doesn't have much of a mountaineering culture, really. We're all about rugby, or back then we were all about rugby, cricket, and maybe surfing. That's your lot. So this was pretty fringe, going to Everest. And the newspaper decided that they could kind of jazz up the coverage if they ran a competition to find a woman to join the team. So this was very early kind of reality television competition.
Right.
We weren't even using the word reality television yet, but looking back, this was the beginning of it.
Wow.
And so the team leader tried to present it as if it was an apprenticeship on the team, which was kind of, was a thing that, as I said, happened with expeditions. The newspaper very much presented it as if it was a competition to find a woman who would then be flown from the summit as if she was a flag. It was fairly sexist, the way it was put across in the media.
Right.
And I was in my mid-20s, at university, doing postgraduate, I was doing my master's. And on one hand, I looked at this and went, this is sexist as hell. On the other hand, I looked at it and thought, They're going to come up with a short list of 6 women. Those 6 women will get taken to Kilimanjaro. This was the reality television bit of it. To climb Kilimanjaro as a kind of a test expedition. And there's going to be a TV crew with them. Yeah. And I could get a free trip to Kilimanjaro. I haven't climbed Kilimanjaro yet. So I applied, knowing it was sexist, in the hope that I'd get a free trip to Kilimanjaro. And, Everest, like, whatever. I didn't particularly expect to be the person who was picked to go to Everest. But at the end, I was.
It seems almost a bit surreal then, because you go from just wanting this, you're like, oh, I get a free trip to Kilimanjaro. It's like, oh, great, now I'm going to Everest. And like you said, you're still in your mid-20s, you're at university. Does that make you anxious at that point, or again, is it a case of just another step for what you wanted to do?
No, I mean, on one hand, I guess it was a long time ago. So, but no, it didn't make me desperately anxious. I mean, kind of nervous. I mean, I'm aware I was stepping up onto a much bigger stage. And of course, I'm going on a trip with people I don't know. I mean, a few of the people on the team I had met, because the climbing community is pretty small, but there was nobody there that I knew well. And there were people there I didn't know. So that's a bit inducing.
Yeah.
But no, I did not go assuming that I was a contender to get to the top. I was well aware that I'd got on the team with this kind of slightly weird way. I assumed that I was going to be less experienced than the other people on the team. I went assuming I was going to keep my head down, learn as much as I possibly could, and see how far I could get. And it actually seemed like quite a nice opportunity to see how far I could go before it all became too much. Because I hadn't really had that yet. Everything I'd tried, one way or another, I'd made it work. That doesn't always mean you get to the top of something, because mountaineering as a challenge is actually about 2 things. It's about trying to get to your goal, which is probably the summit of something. But it's also about getting home safely, or extricating yourself from the situation safely. The thing about all of these situations, they're highly, or depends, they are partially unpredictable. Wilderness is wilderness. You can never be quite sure about what the weather's going to do, what the snow is going to be like. There are you can do all the planning in the world, and there's still things out of your control.
Yeah.
You can't predict, you can't forecast. So there's a level of unpredictability about it. And then there's kind of a level of unpredictability about yourself and your team, both physically, emotionally, and then the dynamic of your group. There's quite a lot that can go wrong in that space as well.
Yeah.
So, one of the challenges of mountaineering is recognizing when it's all going wrong, recognizing when you need to drop the summit as your goal and switch to extricating yourself safely becomes the primary goal. And that can actually be quite interesting. So although, the shorthand for that is, oh, we failed. If you have to present it to the media or tell people when you come home. As a climber, it can actually be really satisfying to go like, actually, the shit hit the fan. We found ourselves in deep trouble, and we managed. We thought it through. We pulled out all our emergency plans. We drew on all our emergency training, and we executed. And you can come home going like, I'm proud of that, and I feel a whole lot more confident about my ability as a mountaineer because I managed and survived that experience. So although it looks like failure, it's actually not necessarily. Depends on your point of view. So I went to Everest and like, okay, this surely is the mountain where I am going to reach my limits and kind of get an understanding of how far I can push myself as a mountaineer. And it didn't entirely work because I got to the summit of Everest before I found where those limits were.
And so from that moment, you've been picked to go on this expedition with a team. How do you then begin to train for something like that? Because it almost seems like it's unreplicatable situation and a scenario to even begin to present yourself with anywhere other than actually being on the mountain itself.
It is. It was also an incredibly short timeline. So this competition appeared in the newspapers in mid-November, early November. We went to Kilimanjaro just after Christmas, over New Year. And we left for Everest in the end of March.
Nice.
So that is very, very little
It's only
lead
not
up.
even a year. Wow.
So it's not even 4 months.
Wow.
You know, from early November through to late March. So as soon as I applied, so first of all, I was already fit. I was doing a lot of outdoor sport.
Yeah.
Then as soon as I applied for Kilimanjaro, I started to train as if I was going to Everest, as best as I could. Essentially, it's cardiovascular fitness.
Right.
And then obviously, as soon as I finished Kilimanjaro and knew that I really was going to Everest, I upped that. But I was living in Johannesburg.
Yeah.
You know, it's a big city and a big grass plain. It's not the best place to be training for this kind of thing. But your bottom line is cardiovascular fitness. You need to be doing the training with a rucksack on your back because you've got to be able to carry weight. And beyond that, it's kind of, that's the first half of training, physical training. The second half of physical training is you'll be on the mountain for a long time. Big Himalayan expeditions are going to take 2 months. Yeah. And the way we did it, we did the full walk-in, we did a long expedition. In our case, we were actually out there for nearly 3 months.
Oh.
A lot of your end-level fitness is going to happen while you're already out there in the mountain. There's a good deal of time that gets spent just getting to the base camp.
Yeah.
You can't just get dropped off by a helicopter. Well, you can these days, but you couldn't 25 years ago. So that's the second level of fitness. But the other point is that physical fitness is only one aspect of expedition preparation. Skill and experience, and there's no cramming that in the last 3 months. You might go and do some emergency medical training or something like that. But basically, skill and experience has to have been accumulated already. And I had some, I just didn't know if I had enough. And then kind of mental preparation. And that's all about doing the research, trying to find out as much as you can about the mountain, that kind of thing.
So do you get, because it seems to me that, like, when you say you're already physically fit to that sort of degree where you'll be able to climb the mountain, it's the next step to me would almost be, how would you prepare yourself mentally for that, knowing that you're going to be in these extreme cold, under extreme stress, very tired for so long?
Well, that first Everest expedition was a leap into the dark, because I'd never done an expedition like that. No. I'd done the trips to South America, multiple weeks in remote locations, but it still feels more like an extended holiday, maybe, than something that gets, capital E expedition. Since then, I've done various things, and the best way to prepare yourself is some version of scenario planning. So it's to kind of read up as much as you can, research as much as you can about the mountain, the route, the environment. So that can be looking at maps, photographs, videos, documentaries, other people's books, talking to people who did expeditions on the mountain. All of that would come into research. And then it's trying to either yourself or as part of your team, talk through scenarios. What would happen if, what would we do? And you're essentially visualizing yourself in that situation, and then you're game playing possible problems and possible solutions. And I think on one level, it works about upping your level of confidence, because you've already kind of, it's a kind of an amateur version of the visualization that professional athletes do about competitions. Yeah. You've already visualized yourself doing the thing. which gives you a level of kind of confidence and comfort with the concept. And then game playing problems. One of the problems with something like mountaineering is when things go rapidly or badly wrong, you're probably also very stressed and very tired. So you are not at your best to be doing creative problem solving in a difficult situation. So it really does help mentally if you've already at least imagined some version of this particular problem and imagined a couple of different possible solutions. It means your mind kind of has somewhere to go, as against just having a complete blank slate of panic and having to start to think of any possible way out of this thing. So I think that's what we get out of kind of visualization and scenario planning.
So with all of that, the training you do beforehand, and like you said, you didn't have a particularly long time to do it, and you were there for 3 months. When it comes to the day where you're about to leave to go to Nepal, what are the emotions that are going through, knowing that you're going to be going for such a long time to such a, like you mentioned, an almost volatile place?
Oh, well, that's fine. I mean, I liked expeditions. I thought that was a cool idea. I mean, the first expedition I ever did was to Central Africa. It was supposed to be a bigger team, but everyone couldn't afford it. When it came to actually buying the air tickets. So it ended up being me and a man I barely knew. And we disappeared into Central Africa for 6 weeks at a time when there was exactly zero communication. Forget carrying your mobile phone and blogging daily. My poor mother dropped me, her 21-year-old daughter, off at the airport and just had radio silence for 6 weeks. That's how it worked. There was no rescue. There was no communication. There was no satellite weather reports. So no, disappearing into the Himalaya for 2 months, frankly, with a big team where we had a lot of kind of satellite support and stuff. All of that seemed okay. Honestly, I think the best way for me to deal with it has always been, I've got some kind of long-term plan, as in I have thought through how I think it's going to happen. Across the 8 weeks. We didn't expect to be out there for 12. We thought we were going to be out there for kind of 8. So how I think it's going to play out across the 8 weeks. And then just put that plan to one side and deal with today and tomorrow.
And obviously one of the other aspects is once you actually get there, and imagine, does your attitude change once you're there? Because you're suddenly in the face of this mountain. You've done the traveling all the way to base camp. Like you said, you don't get to helicopter to base camp. You travel all the way to base camp. You've made it. You're at the first stop of what I imagine is many, many nights where you're not sure what's ahead. But does your attitude change at all once you're actually there?
I think there are 2 parts to that. So on one hand, there's just thinking about the mountain. It does come up on you gradually, because we did walk all the way into base camp. So kind of day by day, the mountain range is getting bigger and bigger. And then, you eventually get to base camp. But from base camp, the mountain is enormous. And this thing about foreshortening, you can't see most of it. You're still only seeing the bottom bit of it. So there is no point where you can literally see the whole thing from base camp to the summit. It constantly unfolds a new bit of it as you climb up the mountain. So on one hand, perhaps you're never completely overwhelmed by how enormous it is, because you never really get to see that in one go. On the other hand, you never really get over the anxiety of there's more unknown stuff to deal with. Right up to the summit day, even while you're climbing on the summit day, you still can't see all the way to the summit. So the kind of anxiety about, I'm coping with this now, but what's coming next, that never leaves you. I think it left me at about 8 a.m. on the summit day when I had 2 hours left to go to the summit. That was the first moment where I could see the last bit, and I thought, oh, I can do that. It's going to be fine. But of course, you're still going to get down. So even when you think I'm going to get to the summit, that still doesn't mean you're going to get down safely. That's a separate issue. But I will say that, all of this is assuming that your expedition is a normal, properly functioning expedition.
Mm.
My first Everest expedition turned out to be radically dysfunctional, not because of the mountain, but because of the team. The team was dreadful. The infighting in the team was epic.
Wow.
This is a whole nother story, which we definitely don't have time for, but that's one of the reasons I ended up being a motivational speaker, because it ended up making a really good case study about team dysfunction.
Right.
But at the time when it was playing out, it was horrible. And I'd never experienced anything like that on an expedition before. And we had the media watching us. And there's nothing they like better than conflict or, kind of dramatic bad news. So we were doing a kind of a reality television version of when Big Brother breaks down and everybody starts to fight with each other in the house.
But it's on the side of Mount Everest.
Yeah. Well, this played out on the way to Mount Everest. We actually had 3 members of the team who walked out in a failed power play to take over control of the expedition. And I mean, the whole thing really was ridiculous, but also deeply traumatic. Those of us who stuck it out and arrived at base camp managed to kind of reform ourselves into a rather more functional team. But I have to say the whole expedition was kind of traumatic, not because of the mountain, but because of the team dynamic. It was awkward.
Obviously, on the other side of that, and you mentioned that most of it wasn't because of the mountain, but you were actually on the mountain and meant to be summiting on the days of the 1996 disaster, which was eventually turned into a movie about it. It's like, what are your memories about those days that went by, the blizzard and having been stuck there, not being able to move?
Well, let me put in 2 caveats and then I'll tell you about what it actually felt like. So that storm is famously the worst storm in the history of Everest and has produced at least 12 books and a Hollywood movie from 2015 and several documentaries and so on and so on. The thing about turning into a best-selling disaster, if everybody dies, nobody comes home to write a best-selling book and then sell the screenplay to Hollywood. So actually, some of the worst Himalayan disasters ever aren't particularly well known because everybody died.
Yeah.
This Everest one wasn't actually the worst storm there's ever been. It was a relatively bad storm in which some people got unlucky, but also some very famous people got unlucky. And there was a very famous journalist who then went on and wrote a best-selling book. So the kind of the worst storm in the history of Everest has more to do with the survivors and how famous they were and the journalist and his book than with it actually being the worst storm that has ever happened on a mountain.
Yeah, I get you.
So, that's one interesting side of it. The other interesting side, and I think anyone who's ever been to war might be able to associate with this. When you're in the middle of a big disaster, they talk about the fog of war. When you're pinned down and you really don't know what's going on. And to some extent, I suspect that when the history books are written, you don't know at the time that you are in the D-Day landings or you're at the Battle of the Somme. You just know shit's going down and this is awful and you're just trying to survive and you've got no bloody idea what's going on. And it's sort of only in retrospect that you realize that this thing you were part of is actually that important. And being in that big storm was a little bit like that. At the time, it was the fog of storm. We didn't really know what was going on, which meant, among other things, we didn't really realize how bad it was.
Yeah.
There's much less communication than people assume. So, okay, let me give you a bit of context. Try and keep this.
Sure.
Try and keep this tight. There are roughly 13 teams on the mountain. It's one of the first years where they'd allowed multiple teams on the same route. So this is a bit new for everybody. When you go for the summit, depends entirely on the weather patterns. The jet stream winds whip across the summit of Everest. Those are the same winds that let planes fly fast from Europe to America. I think you fly faster coming east than going west because you're either with the winds or against the winds. It's those winds. They are going round the planet. And they catch the top of Everest, except in May when they lift. That's why May is the month to try and the best month. You can go in other months, but May is the best month. And what you're looking for is a window when the winds lift. It's relatively wind-free, so it's warmer. Those winds can be so strong they can pick people up and blow them away. So you really do need the winds to be down. So you're looking for those wind-free days, what we call the weather windows, and you can't really predict them in advance. You can predict them with a couple of days if you're getting weather reports. And we had kind of very early versions of satellite weather forecasting. But this is 25 years ago. It wasn't that good. Also, the Himalaya, not that many weather stations. So your data isn't as good as weather forecasting in Europe or North America. So, and obviously you've got to kind of have your team acclimatized and have your equipment in place all the way up to your top camp to then take advantage of the next weather window that comes. So we get a weather window on the forecast. There are 4 teams that are in a position to try and move up and take advantage of it. We are one of them. There's a team from Taiwan, and they're the 2 famous teams, both commercial, one led by Rob Hall, famous New Zealand guide, one led by Scott Fisher, famous American guide. And this is also probably the first time that guiding on Everest has really begun to be a thing. So we have people like us who are an old-fashioned national expedition. No guide, everyone's a climber at some level of experience. And then on the other hand, you've got these commercial guided teams. We get up to the 4th camp because we've been lower down on the mountain waiting for a good weather forecast. We all move up the mountain. That takes a couple of days. We all arrive at the top camp on the 9th of May. The weather isn't brilliant. It's been good, but then in the late afternoon, we get a kind of wind and small snowstorm, and it feels unsettled. And we're not sure what to do. We know, us, the South African team, we're the least experienced of these 4 teams. We know that the 2 big guided teams are going. You leave at midnight, so you've kind of got to decide the afternoon of the day before what you're going to do. We know they're going to go, but we also know the weather isn't brilliant. So we don't know what to do. And one of the things that's worth doing with an expedition is to set some absolute parameters before you leave home. Because you get what I believe in the army they would call mission creep. In the heat of the moment, you can talk yourselves into taking a little bit more risk and a little bit more and a little bit more before you've ended up somewhere ridiculously risky. But because you did it step by step by step, you didn't realize how committed you've become. So it's quite useful at the beginning to agree as a team, there are certain things we do not do. It doesn't matter how tempted we are. And one of our agreements had been, we don't climb into unknown ground in unstable weather. So what I mean by that, this is climbing siege style, up, down, up, down, up, down. Alpine style is a different thing, which I've done subsequently, but we were doing siege style, slightly old fashioned. So you go up the first time and you want to do that in good weather. Then you're probably going to have to go back up again to carry some equipment, to acclimatize. And you can do that in worse weather because you know where you're going. So don't go into unknown ground in unstable weather. And of course, we haven't been above Camp 4. Camp 4 is our summit, our highest point.
Yeah.
So it's like, do we really want to be trying to climb this unknown route to the summit of Everest in this weather? Like, yeah, this is breaking the agreement. And eventually, we argued about this for hours.
Right.
And eventually, like, no, we made these rules for a reason. We will wait and see if the weather improves tomorrow. We wait, they go, the weather's good. They get to the summit, which is a pretty heart-sinking moment because we can catch some of their radio communications. Obviously, you can dial into other people's radio frequencies. And we know they're on the summit of Everest, and we know we're sitting at the top camp. And it's like, we should have been braver and more ambitious and more courageous and, just tougher and like, And then as they were trying to come back down, the storm blew in. And so at that point, we go into our second night at Camp 4 at 8,000 meters. This is the night where we thought we'd leave for the summit, but obviously we're not going to because there's a storm, a serious, prolonged storm. And, but we don't know what's happened to those other teams.
No.
It's not as if you can WhatsApp them. That didn't work like that. People are carrying radios. You don't get to recharge your radio batteries. So you can't have your radios on all the time. You turn your radio on briefly. You try and talk to your base camp. Teams are on different frequencies because the last thing you want is like, cross radio chatter. It's incredibly hard to get a decent radio signal in a storm. So we're just sitting there in our tents. We don't know what's going on. And eventually we talk to our radio. We have set times to call into our base camp. And our base camp tells us that they're hearing from other base camps that some climbers appear to still be missing on the mountain. But of course, missing on the mountain, the most obvious thing that happens is they're fine, but their radios are dead. Their batteries are dead. So, your first assumption, because you can't be a mountaineer if you're going to catastrophize about everything. Mountaineers tend to be pragmatic. So your first assumption is they're fine, but their radios are dead. They're back at the top camp. But slowly, it became more apparent that possibly they weren't fine, or they couldn't communicate with their top camps. And eventually we got a request if we could go out and try and work out who was actually back at camp.
Yeah.
Is this just a dead battery problem? Or are there actually people missing in the storm? Because it wasn't at all clear. And that's where, again, I think people completely misunderstand how confusing it is.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, nip outside and see if the guys are in the tents down the way. Okay. It's the middle of the night. It's pitch dark. The wind is so strong you can't stand upright. You actually have to be bent down to try and brace against the wind.
Wow.
It's coming directly into your eyes. Tiny shards of ice. So you could put your sunglasses on or your goggles, but they're designed to be worn in the daytime. So as soon as you put your sunglasses on, you can't see a thing. If you take your sunglasses off, you've got ice coming straight into your eyes. Your head torch is your only source of light. All it does is illuminate all the ice in the storm. So all you can see is kind of this moving cloud of milky cloud. Like, okay, out you go, into this, brace down, go and find the tents of the other teams. Now, there are 13 teams. Everyone has left tents on this enormous area, say it's about, 4 or 5 football fields big.
Right.
So the tents of 13 teams up there. There are only so many tents, so many brands, models that are suitable for this.
Yeah.
1996, the color of choice is yellow. So there are yellow tents from 13 teams across a space of several football fields wide. You don't know which tents hold the teams that are here and which are the tents of the teams who are still down at base camp. Okay.
wander off, find yourself a tent in the storm, start shaking the tent, yelling, is anybody in there? They can't hear you. They're probably asleep. They might be asleep. 3 o'clock in the morning if they've just come down from the summit of Everest. They might be asleep. They might be awake, but they can't hear you because of the storm. They might be awake with their earphones plugged in. I mean, Sony Walkman days, so probably not. But so like you're yelling, you don't get a reply. That still doesn't tell you anything. Okay, open the tent. The zipper's frozen. You're wearing massive sets of gloves. So take all your gloves off to try and get down to your inner gloves so you can pick up a frozen zip, pull the zip open up the inner tent, look inside, it's empty.
Oh.
Okay, is it empty because it's a tent of a team that are at base camp? Or is it empty because it's a tent of a team where the climbers are missing in the storm? How do you know? So like, okay, go off and find another tent. See if you can find anybody. If you find someone, ask them which team they're from. Ask them who's missing. You find somebody from one of the commercial teams. And these are commercial clients. There's less kind of team spirit in commercial clients. It's you paid a big check for you to be taken to the top of Everest. There are a bunch of strangers on the team with you who also paid a check, whatever. You find there's a guy, I got to the top of Everest, or I turned back, it was awful. I'm exhausted. No, I don't know where the guides are. No, I don't know what happened to the people who were behind me. Like, okay, that's not very helpful either. So abandon that tent. Now the wind is howling like this. So you've checked 3 yellow tents and you're trying to work out the next tent. You get to another yellow tent. Is this a yellow tent you've checked already? Or is this a yellow tent? And at this point, you're freezing and you're disorientated and you're beginning to wonder, I wonder where my tent is. Because I'd quite like a cup of coffee and a break. And I'm not entirely sure where I am on this football field of storm. And oh great, the South Africans have got black tents, which is not the best choice in the world. And now I need to, in the middle of the night, to find my way back to my black tent so I can take a break and warm up my hands and send some information down to base camp, and where the answer is, no, sorry, we still don't know what's going on.
Wow.
So that's one side of it. And the other side of it is, if you're not doing that, we're sitting awake because the big risk. So inside the tent, it's fine. We're out of the wind. We've got the sleeping bags. We've got the stove. We've got supplies. It's fine. But if the tent tears, it's not fine. So two layers of nylon are all that are sitting between us and the storm. So you can't afford to have the tent tear. If the fabric tears, the tent will get blown open and everything in the tent will just blow off. So you can't afford to have that happen if you're in your thermal underwear and your socks. So we're sitting there through the night fully dressed in case the tent tears, with the equipment we would need to grab if the tent tears. But the tent isn't tearing because it is, after all, a good tent. So you're sitting there waiting for a possible disaster. It probably won't happen, but it might. And it's boring. It's frightening, but it's also very boring. And you can't actually sit there being thoroughly frightened endlessly. We're just not very good at that. So if you're like, I wonder if I could go to sleep for a bit. No, fully dressed, or we had another cup of coffee, or, It's a weird experience, and I think it's actually rather different from what people might assume. When they've, just read about it afterwards. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No. It's brilliant. Lots of, so many different angles that I imagine people don't understand from being actually in that situation. And despite everything that happened to you on Everest, one of the most extraordinary things that seems to have happened was when you got back to South Africa, you were met with criticism.
Yes.
Which must have been bizarre to go through.
Oh no, well,
I mean, everybody was met with criticism. Yes, the South African situation was bad. Obviously at the beginning we'd had all of this infighting and all of this drama, and the people who left the team then went home and did a whole lot of press interviews trying to justify why they'd left the team. So that didn't help. But it also, we got to the summit after the storm. We went back a couple of weeks later. We were the last team that got to the summit, and a member of our team was killed on the way down. And as I said, South Africa didn't have a mountaineering culture. So no matter how much we'd said, this is actually genuinely risky, I don't think anybody really believed it. When you're bigging up a project to try and make the media coverage sound more dramatic, but nobody actually means it, hashtag lives on the line, but it's just a hashtag. So I think it was a hell of a shock when it actually turned out to be an activity that can get people killed. And obviously losing a member of your team is devastating. So it was devastating for us, and then we have to try and explain what happened, and we didn't know what happened, which makes it sound like it's a cover-up. So we got massive mixed media coverage. We got the whole spectrum. But all the teams on Everest, those big commercial teams, the survivors got criticized. It was probably the first year, that we could run websites from base camp. Websites as a thing for the public were only about 18 months old at that point.
Wow.
This is the the birth of the internet age. And this was the first year that it had been possible to run a website from base camp using a satellite uplink signal. So it was the first year that it had ever been possible to follow an Everest expedition in semi-real time. I mean, these days people are basically Snapchatting as they climb Everest. So we didn't have that level of access, but you could communicate with the base camps via satellite phones, and you could follow their websites. And so this meant that when this disaster happened, this big storm, Everest went viral in the beginning of the modern sense, and that had never happened before. So it was this thing that the media discovered they could do, and that the public discovered they could follow, and that meant that the whole thing was hugely controversial, but hugely public in a way that had never happened before.
And obviously you've mentioned it a few times, but I know you're of the opinion where talking about climbing Everest today isn't actually a significant challenge like it was when you did it, because of how commercialized it is.
Well, I think what one has to acknowledge is that the world changes. So what I did was not the same as what Edmund Hillary did. Well, I mean, there are a whole lot of stages. What George Mallory did back in the 1920s was a different thing from what Edmund Hillary did, because even though the first ascent of Everest, great job, what people don't realize is a year before, the Swiss had got within a couple of 100 meters of the summit of Everest. And Tenzing Norgay, the Nepalese Sherpa who got to the summit with Edmund Hillary, had been on the Swiss team. So Tenzing Norgay had climbed 95% of Everest already. So, even what Edmund Hillary did was different from, say, George Mallory, when they had to find Everest before they could start then working out how to try and climb Everest. And we kind of forget the difference. We put Mallory and Hillary together as the good old days. And then what they did was different from, say, the British teams in the mid-1970s, the Southwest Face, those Bonington expeditions. And so I was at the beginning of the modern era, the end of the old-fashioned big national teams, the beginning of the modern commercial teams. So, people could with absolute honesty look at what I did and say, oh, well, that's not the same as what the boys did back in 1975. And they're right. We had 13 teams on the same route. a lot of the difficulty was shared. Setting the icefall was shared between the different teams, for example. But what I did was different from what happens now, where they basically have a fixed safety line from base camp to the summit. And you've got a guide telling you what to do, so you don't have to worry about any of that experience stuff I was talking about, you know, any of the kind of judgment side of the skill. All you have to do is be physically fit enough. And you've got a guide telling you what to do. You've got a Sherpa carrying all your equipment. If you pay enough, they'll put you on oxygen from about 6,000 meters. You know, normally people using oxygen used it from 8,000 meters. And you just clip into the safety line and you follow the line all the way up to the summit. It is a very different game. But, you know, I don't want to turn into the like, oh, in my day it was all good and nowadays it's all terrible in the youth of today. It's different.
And obviously, in terms of those achievements, one thing that you went afterwards, and something that I very much admire, was the Manga Parbat. Is it the Monzo Ridge? And it Mazzeno Ridge, sorry. And it's that going somewhere which nobody had completed before. It seems, and you've seen the pictures of it and of what it looks like and how incredibly tight it must be the whole way, and to be at that sort of altitude for such a long time, to do that, how much of a different experience was that to doing Everest?
Radically different. So this is the Mazzeno Ridge of Nanga Parbat. It's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do in the Himalaya. It was the longest unclimbed ridge in the high Himalaya. And some friends of mine had been on it before, years and years before, and they decided to try again and invited me to join the team. And this was very different. So firstly, because we were the only team on the route. Then we were climbing alpine style, which means, yes, you need to acclimatize, but once you're acclimatized, you pick up a rucksack with all your equipment, all your food, all your gas. You're carrying your tents, you're carrying your sleeping bag every day. And you just move in one push. There's no resupply, there's no going back for more, there's no leaving tents up on the mountain at different campsites. Every morning you pack up the camp, you put it in your rucksack, and you keep on climbing. So that's much more difficult as a way of climbing. It's the modern style. It's increasingly uncommon for people to do big siege expeditions unless they are commercial guides and clients expeditions. And then you've got the unknown aspect. Obviously, the ridge had been tried before. So we actually had a fair amount of information. But the fact remains, no one had ever managed to finish the whole thing. So there's a reasonably big unknown component about it. And because the ridge is incredibly long, it's roughly 4 or 5 miles long, and it sits at 7,000 meters. So you're having to camp at 7,000 meters night after night for about a week. That's very high. Most people keep their camps as low as possible, push up to the height, get it done, and then come back down. So to continue to sleep at 7,000 meters night after night after night and try to keep on climbing day after day, that's tough. So the whole thing was much tougher. And frankly, I have no intention of ever doing anything quite that difficult or quite that risky again. So, you know, I talked earlier about wondering what it would be like to finally meet my limit. Then that felt like meeting my limit, looking over into the abyss and going, yeah, no thanks. Enough of that. So we got 2 people to the top. All 6 of us made the first summit attempt. It didn't work out. At that point, we'd run out of food. We were about to run out of gas. The other thing that made this difficult, normally you go up and you come back down the same way, which means at least when you're coming down, you know where you're going. But because the ridge was so long, there was no coming back. The only way to go down, you'd go straight down. You're doing a traverse, which meant going down was still 2 days of climbing down a route we'd never seen before. So you're still basically going forward, even though you're going down. So that made the whole process of going down considerably more risky. So yeah, after 11 days, we were only carrying 10 days of food. The plan wasn't long enough. We made the first summit attempt after 11 days. We blew it. We chose the wrong line. And at that point, 4 of us said, we are out of here. We've got 3 biscuits and a tea bag left. We are going to use that to get down. And 2 of the team, who both are world-class mountaineers, tried again on sort of 3 energy bars and a couple of tins of gas. And they got to the summit, I think, on day 14, and they got to the bottom on day 18. It was a completely epic undertaking. But yeah, it was an amazing expedition.
Because it's amazing though, because you read about how you prepared for 8, maybe 10 days, and you've gone more than double that. It's like the thought process, was it, because it sounds almost to the point where it was almost an easy decision to go, actually, no, we've got no food left, we're not going to make it. Was that thought process quite a quick one then?
For me, it was. So it's not that I don't have regrets about that expedition. We made various choices in the process of the climb, which didn't work out all that well and lost us a lot of time. So we probably lost 3 days to some poor choices. But one of the interesting things, frankly, about making choices is it's not as if there's a right choice and there's a wrong choice. There's a choice and then consequences. So with hindsight, I can go like, oh, we chose to do A and that got us into trouble because of B. But the thing is, if we'd chosen to do something else, I don't know what trouble it would have got us into that we kind of didn't predict. So it's not actually right choices, wrong choices. But nevertheless, some choices had consequences which lost us time. So possibly we could have saved about 3 days if we'd made slightly different choices. And we didn't get our choices between resting and pushing correct either. It was incredibly difficult to work out when you should be being ambitious and pushing, particularly when you're running out of time. And when you really ought to rest, because if you don't rest, you will continue to make poorer and poorer choices because you're so tired. So working out when to rest is really hard. So I regret some of that. If we'd been there 3 days earlier, if every choice had been the best possible choice, we could probably have got everyone to the top. But in the moment where I went, I am done, that wasn't a particularly hard choice. Because the other thing people miss, I think, is that it's not just about you. If you think about running a marathon, you can keep on running until you actually fall to your knees. Because at that point, you crawl across to the side of the road, you pull out your mobile phone, and you call a taxi. My point is that it's actually reasonably easy to bail from a marathon or something like that. A lot of the sports we do normally. On a mountain, if you keep on climbing until the point where you collapse onto your knees, now what? You can't climb down again if you've kept going until that point. How are you going to get down? Your teammates are going to have to abandon their attempt at the summit and try and help you to climb back down the mountain. So it is very bad practice for your own safety and for the safety of the rest of your team to not give up until you literally physically collapse. You need to give up while you still have enough left in the metaphorical tank to climb yourself all the way back down the mountain. How much do you need? You don't know. Because maybe the snow is fine and the sun is shining and the navigation is easy and you only need a little bit of energy to get yourself to the bottom. And maybe the snow is shitty thigh-deep sugar. And maybe the mist is going to be in for the next 2 days, so the navigation is going to be awful. And maybe the wind is going to be howling, and maybe you're going to lose the route. and end up in some really treacherous terrain, in which case you need a whole lot more energy.
Yeah.
So how do you know when you need to stop going up because it's time to use the last of your energy to go down? You don't.
Can't.
You make a best guess based on your previous experience. And so by the time, at the end of day 11, when I made my decision, it was like, firstly, I don't have a great deal left in the tank, and I have a great deal of unknown ground to get down this mountain. And secondly, if I try and go to the summit again, all I'm going to do is endanger Rick and Sandy, who are, climbers who are a level better than I am, absolutely. And that could turn out to be deeply dangerous for all of us and unfair to them. I'm not a strong link at this point if I, keep trying to summit. I'm a weak link, and I need to recognize that. So I think there's a kind of a level of personal responsibility in climbing as well, about making sure that you stand down in time and don't end up simply endangering the rest of your team and, sinking the overall attempt to get to the top.
And it's quite extraordinary, really, because you speak about it so amazingly well, and obviously you do the speaking in all over the world, and it's with your experiences behind you. What sort of things have you learned from that, which you then go on to tell people that you can almost equate to day to day, because they're, like I said, they're so different, so redoable in a normal situation?
Yes, it's interesting where it meets with day-to-day experience and where it doesn't. And I think it meets in a couple of places. So effectively, this is just project management. I mean, it's a slightly bizarre project, but, all the elements of project management are there. And in some ways, it makes a fairly interesting case study because it's both simplified and exaggerated. So, I mean, the place where my experience meets the needs of my corporate clients are with kind of project management and team management. Mm. And the reason why these make interesting case studies is it's simpler. Your risks are bigger, your team is smaller, your goal is clearer, and your timeline is short. So, but it's also more dramatic. And the price you pay for everything is bigger. The risks are bigger, but the consequences of making a mistake come back to you much faster than they do in, say, corporate teams. The level of stress is much more acute, which means teams spiral into bad behaviors much more quickly because they're so acutely stressed and because they're trapped together 24/7. So it's this simplified, exaggerated version of team management and project management, which makes it kind of an interesting case study to look at what's happening. What do people do in this situation of stress and difficulty? What are the kind of behaviors that come out? What are the kind of tools we can try and implement to reduce conflict and build performance within the team? What are the kind of tools we can use within the team to manage uncertain circumstances? So, right now, coronavirus times, the thing I tend to be talking about is kind of managing uncertainty, managing unpredictable circumstances, because you really can't, there's only so much you can do to control your mountain. If the weather's good, then all your previous experience and planning is quite useful. But if the weather turns bad, if the snow conditions turn out to be something weird you haven't seen before, it can get deeply unpredictable. And you're just going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to chuck the plan that you meticulously worked out beforehand and start making a new plan literally as you are trying to climb the mountain. So managing that level of unpredictability while holding your team together and staying focused on your summit, your goal, is kind of what I talk about at the moment with clients. And but the other thing is, let's be completely honest, I'm not changing the world. I'm not going to stop some companies sinking into bankruptcy because they had a half an hour talk from me. Half the time I'm there to provide interesting entertainment. They've got a thoroughly serious, boring, financially driven, depressing, day-long, 3-day-long corporate meeting. And they bring in somebody like me to tell them a story about something utterly different, but that does have a couple of kind of takeaways that apply back to what they're trying to do.
Obviously, you are, like you said, you're a mountaineer first. And it's do you still have, and you're a skier as well? Do you still have plans to go on explorations? What's next for you?
Yes, but a couple of caveats. People sometimes assume that the only thing worth climbing in mountaineering is an 8,000 meter peak, which is nonsense. In some ways, climbing at very high altitude limits what you can do because of the lack of oxygen and the acute cold. So you can actually do more technically difficult climbing on lower mountains because you've got more oxygen to work with. You don't have to be incredibly dressed up to cope with the cold.
Yeah,
so there's plenty of incredibly interesting climbing to be done that's not on an 8,000 meter peak. So 8,000 meter peaks aren't the most interesting. The Himalaya is not the most interesting place in the world. There is interesting climbing to be done all over the world. Big snow and ice expeditions are interesting, but so is rock climbing. You know, technical, clinging on by your fingertips, rock climbing on beautiful sun-drenched cliffs in Spain is a wonderful thing to do. And you can have a hot shower and a decent cup of coffee at the end of the day. You know? So there's all sorts of levels of climbing and of adventure and of being out in the mountains. And I like almost all of it. I don't really like ice climbing or bouldering, but I like a lot of it. I also like taking my skill sets and putting them into situations that are kind of build on what I've done before, but also challenge me to take on something new. So I had 2 expeditions for 2020. One of them has been sunk by coronavirus.
Yeah, of course.
The other one may yet be sunk by the coronavirus, but we're not sure. So the one that may still go ahead is a sea kayaking trip along a fairly remote piece of the coast of Greenland. So 6 of us, fully self-sufficient, all the equipment in the sea kayaks, and we're simply going exploring along some remote fjords. And it's not groundbreaking, and I'm sure somebody's been there before, and I don't care. I'm just interested in taking my cold weather experience and my limited sea kayaking experience and kind of putting them together in this expedition. And I just want to kayak with icebergs. Yeah, let's be honest. I'm going for the icebergs. So that's the kind of thing that interests me at this point. And the one that got sunk would have been Antarctica. We would have sailed from the point of South America to Antarctica and then spent a week doing ski mountaineering, trying to do a couple of mountains that had never been climbed before. Oh. But the trouble is we needed to charter the boat in spring, like a month ago, and it's expensive. And everybody on the team, we're all self-employed one way or another. And the minute coronavirus hit and we all lost all our work. It's like, this is sinking a whole lot of money into a trip to Antarctica is a bad idea. Let's keep the money just in case none of us work again in 2020 and we'll come back to it another year.
And finally, a very generic question, but which is your favorite expedition that you've done?
No. That question is unanswerable. Because it's never just about, what's the mountain. It's about the experience, and the experience is about the mountain, and but it's also about the people you went with. It's about the weather, and sometimes it's not even about whether or not you were successful, because if the weather was great and the snow was fine and the team was fine and your plan just unfolded fine, it's like, well, that was nice. It was like, I don't know, eating a nice slice of cake. That was nice, but it wasn't actually. Sometimes the most interesting expeditions are when things went wrong in dramatic ways, but you managed despite that, or you overcame them and got yourself out safely. That can be part of what makes an expedition thoroughly interesting. So I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
It must be hard to think of. I suppose that the idea would be which one would you like to live through the most again, perhaps.
Oh, but that's difficult too, because with hindsight, when you know how badly it's going to go wrong and how hard you're going to have to work to get out, it's one thing to be proud of having survived that, but I don't necessarily want to do it again. I've done some amazing rock climbing trips, particularly with one friend of mine, where we've climbed together for 30 years. We get on really well. And I've done a couple of trips with him where it didn't go quite to plan. I always find that quite interesting. It didn't go quite to plan. We had to come up with a new plan on the go, but we did. And we managed to do some amazing things off the new plan.
Yeah.
And I'd probably choose one of those trips before. One of them was to the Lofoten Islands, rock climbing, multi-pitch rock climbing, mostly trad climbing in far northern Norway in the middle of summer, 24-hour sunlight on this archipelago. Amazing place. Another one was a trip to North America where we failed to climb El Capitan on the nose. It was just too hot and we just weren't good enough. And instead we went off and did some amazing multi-pitch rock climbing in the Sierra Nevada. And that was one of those kind of spontaneous trips where you completely change the plan and then realize, wow, this was a good choice. This was correct. Yeah, I really do like rock climbing.
No, I guess it's something when you love it so much, answering a question like that is basically nearly impossible when you have so many brilliant memories of it. But overall, thanks so much for joining me. I've learned a hell of a lot from a short talk, to be fair, already, about so much that I didn't know about, and I can very clearly see why you're a motivational speaker to a lot of people.
Thank you. No, it's been a pleasure. It's been a fun chat, and it's quite fun when I get to talk about stuff which doesn't follow quite the standard line of questions.
No.
So that's always enjoyable.